The knock came late at night. Slow, hesitant. Like the person on the other side already knew they had no right to be there. At first I ignored it. I wasn't expecting anyone. My evenings were sacred. A glass of wine, soft jazz humming through the speakers, and the peace I had built for myself over the years. But the knocking didn't stop. It grew more desperate, more insistent. I set my glass down and sighed. Maybe it was a neighbor. Maybe someone's car had broken down. But when I reached the door and peered through the peephole, my breath caught in my throat. Two figures stood on my doorstep. Old, frail. Their clothes hung loose on their thin frames, tattered and dull from wear. The man's shoulders were slumped, his once commanding posture now a mere ghost of what it used to be. The woman beside him clung to his arm as if she needed him to stay upright. Their faces were hollow, their skin sallow, their eyes sunken. And yet, despite the years that had passed, I recognized them instantly. My parents. A slow wave of emotions crashed over me. Not love. Not relief. No, nothing soft or forgiving. Just a deep, cold numbness. I hadn't seen them in 3 decades. Not once. Not a letter. Not a phone call. Because to them I had never existed. And now here they were. At my door. I let the silence stretch, savoring the discomfort in their eyes before I finally unlatched the lock and pulled the door open. They shivered as the warm air from my house brushed against their chilled skin. Their eyes flickered to me, taking in my silk robe, my polished nails, the elegance of the life I had built. My father swallowed hard. My mother's lips trembled. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You must be lost." My mother made a sound, a broken, shaky breath. "Layla," she whispered. "It's us." I tilted my head, feigning confusion. Is that supposed to mean something to me? My father's throat bobbed as he forced himself to speak. His voice was hoarse as if it hadn't been used in days. We're your parents." The words should have meant something. Should have struck a chord, should have unraveled something deep within me. But all I felt was indifference. I studied them slowly, deliberately, as if seeing them for the first time. Their sunken cheeks. Their cracked lips. The way their hands twitched at their sides as if itching to beg but clinging, barely, to some last shred of dignity. Finally I exhaled and said, "I don't have parents." And I started to close the door. My mother lunged forward, her bony fingers grabbing my sleeve with a strength that startled me. "Please," she gasped. "We have nowhere else to go." Her voice cracked, raw with desperation. "We're starving. We have nothing, Layla. Nothing. Nothing." The word echoed in my mind, but it didn't stir pity. They had given me nothing. They had left me with nothing. And now they wanted something from me? I should have slammed the door. I should have turned my back, let them disappear into the cold night like ghosts. But an idea crept into my mind. A wicked, delicious idea. Shutting the door would be too easy. Oh, I wanted more than that. I wanted to make them feel it. I wanted them to understand with every fiber of their being what it was like to be discarded like a piece of unwanted trash. I met my mother's tear-filled gaze. Then slowly, deliberately I stepped aside. "Come in," I said. They hesitated, blinking in disbelief. "Go on," I urged. "You said you had nothing, right? Let's see if that's true." My father was the first to move. He stepped forward cautiously as if expecting me to slam the door in his face. My mother followed, clutching his arm, her movements shaky. I watched them enter my home, the home I had built without them. And as I shut the door behind them, I smiled to myself. This was going to be fun. 30 years ago, in a quiet village where traditions dictated the worth of a child before they could even speak, a baby girl was born into the Khan family. She should have been a son. Her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Khan, had spent months preparing for a boy. A name had already been chosen, Ayan, meaning God's gift. His future had been mapped out before he even existed. He would inherit the family's wealth, take over his father's business, and bring honor to their name. But when the midwife wiped the newborn clean and wrapped her in a thin cloth, she hesitated before speaking. "It's a girl," she said softly. The room fell silent. The baby's father, Ibrahim Khan, stared down at his wife, his expression unreadable. Her mother, Aisha, lay weak from labor, but her eyes darted toward her husband in fear. She knew what he was thinking. A girl was not a gift. A girl was a burden. Mr. Khan turned his back without another word and walked out of the room. The midwife, unsure of what to do, tried placing the newborn in her mother's arms, but Aisha didn't reach for her. She merely turned her face away, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. The baby wailed, her tiny fists curling in distress. But no one comforted her. No one celebrated her birth. She was nameless. Wanted. Mistake. For the first few days of her life, the baby girl remained in her mother's care, but no love was given to her. No lullabies were sung. No gentle hands rocked her to sleep. On the third night, while the baby lay in a wooden cradle hungry and crying, Mr. Khan made his decision. "I won't waste my fortune raising a daughter," he declared. "She will bring us nothing but shame." Aisha, still recovering from childbirth, hesitated. "But what will we do with her?" Her husband's face was stone. "Get rid of her." And just like that, my fate was sealed. Under the cover of darkness, my parents carried me to the outskirts of town, where a rundown orphanage stood at the edge of a dirt road. They didn't leave me with a note. They didn't wrap me in a warm blanket. They simply placed me on the doorstep, knocked once, and walked away without looking back. I was 3 days old. 3 days in this world, and already I had been discarded like an unwanted possession. The orphanage caretaker, an elderly woman named Sister Miriam, found me the next morning. She lifted me into her arms and clucked her tongue in dismay. "Another one," she muttered. It wasn't the first time a child had been abandoned here. It wouldn't be the last. Life at the orphanage was not kind, but it was the only life I knew. There was never enough food to go around, never enough blankets to keep us warm at night. I learned early that crying did no good. Tears wouldn't fill an empty stomach. Most of the children came and went, taken in by families looking to adopt. But not me. No one wanted a nameless girl with no history. So I named myself Layla, I told the other children when they asked. I had heard the name once from one of the caretakers and liked how it sounded. Layla. A girl who belonged to no one. A girl who would make her own way. I realized early on that if I wanted something, I had to fight for it. While other children played, I studied. I devoured every book I could find, teaching myself everything from math to business. I wasn't just learning for the sake of knowledge. I was preparing for the day I would leave the orphanage and carve out my own destiny. When I turned 16, I left. With nothing but a scholarship and a fierce determination to survive, I moved to the city. I worked at a bakery during the day, attended classes at night, and built connections wherever I could. I climbed and climbed and climbed, until one day I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. Years later, I became the founder and CEO of a multi-million-dollar jewelry brand. What started as a small online business had grown into a fashion empire. My designs were worn by celebrities. My name was recognized in high-end boutiques across the country. I had power, wealth, influence. I had become everything my parents had wanted in a son. Everything they had believed I could never be. And now, after all these years, after throwing me away like trash, they had come crawling back. Hungry. Desperate. And they wanted me to save them. I had dreamed of this moment. But they had no idea that the little girl they abandoned had no intention of making their suffering easy. This time they would be the ones begging. The air in my house was warm, filled with the scent of cinnamon tea and the soft hum of jazz playing in the background. My parents sat stiffly on my velvet couch, their thin hands gripping the edges of their seats as if afraid to relax. I took my time watching them, letting the silence stretch. They looked so different from the powerful, prideful figures I had imagined in my childhood nightmares. Time had not been kind to them. My father, once an imposing man with sharp, commanding eyes, now sat with his shoulders hunched, his cheeks hollow, his gaze darting around the room as though he couldn't believe where he was. My mother, once regal and poised, had lost the elegance she had clung to in her younger years. Her hands trembled in her lap, her lips chapped from what I assumed was months, maybe years, of struggling to survive. "How did you find me?" I finally asked, my voice smooth, emotionless. My father cleared his throat, but my mother was the one who spoke. We saw you in a magazine." Her voice was weak, hesitant, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to speak to me. I lifted an eyebrow. "A magazine?" My mother nodded. "Your face was on the cover. It said you were one of the most successful businesswomen in the country." Her lips trembled as she forced out a whisper. "We're so proud of you." I laughed. The sound was sharp, cutting. "Proud?" I repeated, tilting my head. "Is that so?" Neither of them responded. You didn't even give me a name, I continued, my voice calm but laced with ice. You left me with nothing. And now, after 30 years, you want to claim pride in my success. My father shifted uncomfortably. Layla. You don't get to say my name, I snapped. He flinched. My mother let out a quiet sob. I took a slow sip of my tea before setting the cup down with a soft clink. Tell me, why are you really here? My father's jaw tightened. We lost everything. His voice was raw, filled with a bitterness that told me he still hated admitting weakness. The business collapsed. The house was taken. We have nothing left. I hummed. Poetic. He frowned. What? I leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. It's poetic, I repeated. You abandoned me because you thought I had no value. And now you've been reduced to nothing yourselves. I let the words sink in before continuing. Karma is an artist, isn't she? My mother wiped at her eyes. Please, Layla. We have nowhere to go. We haven't eaten in days. I stared at them, savoring the moment. They were finally feeling what I had felt all those years ago. Abandoned. Wanted. Powerless. But this wasn't enough. Not yet. I stood and gestured toward the dining table, where I had left a plate of untouched food from earlier. Go ahead, I said. Eat. Their heads snapped up in disbelief. Really? My mother whispered. I nodded, expression unreadable. My father didn't hesitate. He stumbled to his feet and rushed toward the table, his movements clumsy with hunger. My mother followed, her thin fingers trembling as she reached for a piece of bread. But the moment they touched the food, I spoke. Stop. They froze. I stood in front of them, tilting my head as if studying a piece of artwork. I want you to beg for it. My father stiffened. His pride, though cracked, was still there. Layla, that's not. I interrupted him with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. Oh, but it is. You had no problem leaving me to starve, did you? He said nothing. I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a whisper. So now, if you want to eat in my house, you will beg. My mother was the first to crack. She dropped to her knees, hands clasped together, tears spilling down her wrinkled cheeks. Please, Layla. Please let us eat. I watched her for a long moment, then turned to my father. He was still standing, his fists clenched at his sides. I tilted my head. Are you going to let your wife beg alone? His throat bobbed. His pride warred with his desperation. But in the end, hunger won. Slowly, stiffly, my father sank to his knees beside my mother. His jaw was tight, his face burning with humiliation, but he still forced out the words. Please, Layla, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Please let us eat. A rush of satisfaction filled my chest. I had waited 30 years for this moment. And yet, it still wasn't enough. I exhaled, then reached forward, plucking a piece of bread from the plate. I held it in front of them, watching the way their eyes followed my hand with desperation. Then slowly I crushed it in my palm, letting the crumbs fall to the floor at their knees. You're not worthy of my table, I said softly. My mother sobbed. My father's head dropped in shame. And I simply smiled. This was only the beginning. The next morning I found them curled up outside my house. Despite the crisp morning air, they remained huddled together on the cold pavement. Their pride had been shattered the night before, but their desperation had kept them from leaving. Good. When I stepped outside, my mother looked up, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. My father didn't lift his head. He just sat there, his hands clasped together, staring at nothing. I crouched in front of them, taking my time to study their pitiful state. You didn't leave, I observed, my voice devoid of emotion. We have nowhere else to go, my mother whispered. I tilted my head. Not many options, huh? My father finally spoke, his voice hoarse. Please, Layla. Just let us stay. We'll do anything. Anything. I leaned back, crossing my arms. All right, I said at last. They looked up, hope flickering in their dull eyes. But, I continued, you'll have to earn it. Their hope faltered. You want my help? I said, standing tall over them. Then prove to me that you're worth helping. My father's jaw tightened, but my mother, who had always been the weaker of the two, nodded quickly. We will, she said. Just tell us what to do. I let a slow smile creep onto my face. Good. I led them inside, not to the guest rooms but to the kitchen. If you want food, you will cook it yourselves, I instructed, watching as my mother ran trembling fingers over the stove. If you want shelter, you will clean this house from top to bottom. You will do the jobs that servants do because right now that is all you are, beggars in need of charity. My father's lips pressed into a thin line. You want us to be your servants? I shrugged. Call it what you want. I call it justice. He said nothing, but I could see the war raging inside him. The same man who had thrown me away because I wasn't a son was now being forced to serve the very daughter he had abandoned. And it was killing him. But he still did it. Because he had no choice. For the first time in their privileged lives, my parents worked. They scrubbed floors, washed dishes, dusted shelves. Tasks they had never done before. My mother struggled, her frail body unused to such labor, but she didn't complain. My father, on the other hand, burned with silent fury. I could see it in the tightness of his jaw, in the way his fists clenched around the mop. But he did it. Because he had to. On the second night, when the house was spotless and the kitchen smelled of fresh food, I sat at the dining table, watching them as they stood before me, exhausted. You may eat, I said, gesturing to the floor. They hesitated. I had made sure to place their meals, not on plates but in two small bowls on the ground. Like scraps for dogs. My mother's lips trembled. My father's fists clenched. Eat, I repeated. Slowly, painfully they lowered themselves to the floor. And they ate. Not with utensils but with their hands. Not at my table but beneath it. It was humiliating. And that was the point. The breaking point. Days passed. Then a week. My parents continued their humiliating tasks, enduring every cruel test I threw their way. Cleaning toilets. Washing my car. Even shining my shoes while I watched. Each time I waited for them to snap. But they didn't. And that's when I realized, this wasn't enough. They were enduring it because they still saw it as temporary. A punishment they just had to survive. I needed to break them completely. And I knew exactly how to do it. One evening, after another long day of forced servitude, I stood before them with a decision. You've worked hard, I said, pacing slowly around them. And I must admit I'm impressed. You've swallowed your pride, endured humiliation, and obeyed without complaint. My mother's eyes filled with hope. My father stood taller, as if believing he had finally paid his dues. But, I continued, stopping directly in front of them, it's not enough. Their expressions fell. You threw me away like trash, I said, my voice growing colder. You didn't just leave me, you erased me. You never came back. Never looked for me. I was nothing to you. They lowered their heads. So tell me, I said softly, what is a daughter worth? Silence. Then my mother whispered, more than we ever realized. I scoffed. Not good enough. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto my father's. You wanted a son so badly, didn't you? He flinched. Say it, I ordered. Tell me how much you regret it. Tell me what I was worth. His throat bobbed. You were worth everything. I smiled. Now beg for my forgiveness. A long, heavy silence stretched between us. Then slowly my father, the same man who had once stood tall and proud, the man who had thought a daughter was worthless, fell to his knees before me. His voice was hoarse, broken. Please, he whispered. Forgive me. Please, Layla, forgive us. We were wrong. We were so wrong. My mother followed suit, her frail body trembling as she sank to her knees beside him, her voice barely a whisper. Please, Layla, forgive us. We didn't know, we didn't understand. Please, we beg you. For a moment I stood there watching them both, my mother with her tear-streaked face, my father with his bowed head. I could feel the weight of the years between us, the emptiness that had always existed in place of any real bond. I swallowed the bitter taste of satisfaction that rose in my throat. I wanted to feel joy in this moment. The moment where I finally had control, where I could make them suffer as they had made me suffer. But for some reason it didn't feel as sweet as I thought it would. I had broken them. I had won. But something inside me felt hollow. I stood still, watching them, letting the silence linger. It stretched out like a rope, tugging at something inside me. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the exhaustion of the years of pain, maybe the rawness of seeing them beg, or maybe just the knowledge that I had finally had my revenge. But for some reason the words that were supposed to come next felt stuck in my throat. You should leave, I said instead, the harshness of the words coming out more sharply than I had intended. You've begged enough. You've shown your weakness. My father's shoulders sagged even more if that was possible. His face twisted in anguish, but he didn't move. Layla, please. His voice cracked. Let us stay just for a little while longer. We don't have anywhere else to go. I met his gaze, the rawness of his pain digging into me in a way I wasn't prepared for. The anger, the humiliation, all of it felt so real, so alive inside me. But I wasn't sure anymore if the fire inside me was enough to sustain the cold distance I had created between us. What do you want me to say? I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Do you want me to say I'm sorry too? That I've been holding on to all of this for too long and I'm ready to forgive you? Just like that. They didn't answer, and for a moment, the room was filled with nothing but the sound of our breathing. Slow, uneven. Finally, I took a step back. I've done what I needed to do. And I'm done. You've paid for what you did. But I don't think you deserve anything more than that. Not yet. They both stayed on their knees, their bodies shaking with exhaustion and grief. But I could feel something shifting within me, something I hadn't expected to feel after all the years of hurt and anger. The question that had been plaguing me for days lingered again. What is forgiveness worth? Get up, I said softly, my voice losing some of its edge. You can stay for now. But I'm not doing this because I pity you. They both rose slowly, unsure of what to say or do. I'll allow you to stay for a while, I continued, my voice now a little softer. But I want something in return. They looked at each other, the understanding sinking in. My father spoke first, his voice shaky but determined. Anything. I nodded. You'll work. You'll clean. You'll help around the house just as you've been doing. But you will also learn humility. My mother nodded immediately. We'll do whatever it takes. We don't want to lose you again, Layla. I could see the sincerity in their eyes, but there was something in the way they looked at me now that made me wonder if they had learned the true weight of their actions. Or if they had simply become desperate enough to do whatever it took to survive. And so I allowed them to stay. I let them work, let them prove they could endure the life they had never known. I put them through task after task, small and large, making them scrub floors and polish silverware, ensuring that they understood what it meant to be beneath someone. But there were moments too when I would catch myself watching them work, and for a brief second the hardness inside me would falter. What was it that made them so human in this moment? Was it because they had fallen so far from the pedestal they had placed themselves on all those years ago? Or was it that I, too, had become something different? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. There would be more tests, more demands. And I would continue to watch them bend under the weight of their own guilt. I wasn't done with them, not yet. But for the first time as I watched them work in silence, a small part of me wondered if maybe, just maybe, I was beginning to see them as more than just the villains of my past. Maybe, in the end, it was not just about revenge. Maybe it was about the slow, painful process of learning how to heal. As the weeks passed, I watched my parents transform. The arrogance that once defined them faded, replaced by quiet humility. They no longer hesitated to scrub floors, cook meals, or clean up after themselves. They no longer looked at me with superiority, but with regret, with something that resembled love. And yet the question remained, was it enough? One evening as they sat at the dinner table, not beneath it, I faced them with the final decision. You've done what I asked, I said. You've endured everything. But now I have to decide whether you deserve something more than just survival. Whether you deserve my forgiveness. Silence hung between us. My mother wiped her eyes. My father swallowed hard. And then after a long pause my father spoke. We don't deserve it, he admitted, his voice raw. But we'll spend the rest of our lives trying to earn it. For the first time I saw the sincerity in his words. Maybe they could change. Maybe they already had. And maybe, just maybe, I was ready to let go of the weight I had carried for so long. With a deep breath I finally made my choice.